Hello, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Tracking Worker Militancy with the Labor Action Tracker webinar sponsored by CARO, the Cornell Industrial Labor Relations School's Center for Applied Research on Work. My name is Ann DeCecco. I'm a Senior Research and Policy Development Associate at CARO, and I'm very pleased to kick off this fifth installment of our new World of Work webinar series, which is designed to leverage applied research conducted at the ILR school and partner institutions with the goal of informing policy and practice related to work, labor, and employment. We have an exciting and important topic to dive into today, so I won't take up too much time. Over the past couple of years, we've been seeing an increase in worker militancy and action across the United States, particularly in the growing numbers of workers involved. I'm sure those of you with us today have noted an increase in news coverage talking about last year's hot labor summer and a general resurgence of labor activism. So we're pleased to be able to take a closer look at the Labor Action Tracker tool today and talk with some of the experts behind it about what has been going on. Before we get underway, I first want to thank the ILR School's Dean Alex Colvin for his generous support in funding the Labor Action Tracker. Also, I want to recognize the entire Labor Action Tracker team that puts in a tremendous amount of time and thought in powering the tool. Thank you to ILR's Worker Institute for supporting the research assistants who staff the tracker. And in addition, the team is grateful to the Washington Center for Equitable Growth and the Labor Research Action Network, both of which have funded research related to the tracker. And last but not least, thank you to the staff of the China Labor Bulletin for guiding the way with their strike map, which I understand was the inspiration for this tool. So now I want to give a very big thanks to our distinguished speakers today. First, Johnny Callis, an alum of the Cornell ILR doctoral program and assistant professor at the University of Illinois School of Labor and Employment Relations. Johnny is the project director for the Labor Action Tracker, and the tool was actually his idea back in 2020 when he was studying here at ILR. With the mentorship and support of Dr. Eli Friedman, he worked to bring it from a concept to a sophisticated interactive data visualization tool that researchers, labor activists, policy analysts, and others across the US have come to depend upon. We're very fortunate Dr. Callis could join us today to tell us about his vision for the Labor Action Tracker and how it all started. Next, Deepa Kailasam Iyer, PhD student here at Cornell ILR in the Department of Global Labor and Work. Deepa is instrumental in defining and developing the methodology for the tool and ensuring the data and analysis meet rigorous methodological standards. Catherine Ritchie, who just graduated with her bachelor degree from Cornell ILR a few days ago. Congratulations, Catherine. Catherine is also instrumental to the Labor Action Tracker, working behind the scenes to source its data and research each case. And Daniel Perez, Economic Analyst with the State Policy and Research Team at the Economic Policy Institute, whose research has spanned the role of unions and collective bargaining and promoting working class prosperity, the experiences of Latinos in the US, and policies aimed at addressing the root causes of poverty and inequality. Daniel will share with us how he uses Labor Action Tracker data to support his work at EPI. And finally, I just want to encourage you all to be active participants and enter questions as we go along into the Q&A box. We'll save some time at the end to make sure we can address as many as we can. So now I'm going to turn it over to Johnny Callis. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that introduction, Ann, and for organizing this webinar. So hi, everyone. I'm Johnny Callis, Project Director of the Labor Action Tracker. Really excited to be with you all today. I'm going to provide just a sort of, I don't know about high level, but a background of the project before, I think Deepa, Catherine, and Daniel are going to take us into a little more greater detail about what we do with the tracker and the ways in which researchers and others have really utilized the data. The Labor Action Tracker began in late 2020 as a result of some ideas that I had along with Associate Professor Eli Friedman, back close to 4 years ago now. Obviously, we were at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. There was a lot of social movement activism going on. And we thought it was really important to have a tool that reliably documented strike and labor protest activity across the United States, because there was a bit of gap in terms of official data sources that documented such type of activity. So that was sort of the context in which the tracker was created, was intimately tied to workplace unrest and broader social movement unrest. Oftentimes those two things crossing, that social movement unrest and that workplace unrest in late 2020. As Ann mentioned, we did receive, and I just want to talk a little bit more in detail about the inspiration we received from China Labor Bulletin. This is a group of labor activists now located in Hong Kong who have actually developed and operated a strike map similar to ours for the better part of, I think, a dozen years now. And they provided a lot of guidance to us. And as you can imagine, documenting strikes by workers in China have a lot of challenges in terms of documentation and sources to find information. So we were able to gather a lot of strategies that I think, Deepa will talk about our methodology in greater detail. But we received a lot of inspiration from them to get the project going and along the way over the last few years. And we've really, in a lot of different ways, not entirely, but a lot of different ways, modeled our project off of theirs. So the main goal of the Labor Action Tracker is to create a comprehensive database of strike activity across the United States to overcome limitations in official data sources. The most obvious of which is some limitations from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So some of you may know, but the BLS used to keep really excellent work stoppage data until funding cuts by the Reagan administration in the early 1980s. So if you're a data nerd at all, you can go online and look up work stoppage summary reports from decades worth of different years up until 1979. These are 100-page, sometimes more reports that have really detailed information on strikes and work stoppages. However, since those funding cuts, the BLS has only documented work stoppages involving 1,000 or more workers that last at least an entire shift and occur on a workday defined as a non-weekend, non-federal holiday. So it really captures a small fraction of the total strike activity across the U.S., and that's the major sort of data gap that we have looked to fill through this project. There are also other sources that I just want to allude to. Happy to talk more about this in the Q&A that keep track of work stoppage activity. The most, I think, prominent one, it's behind a paywall, but Bloomberg's work stoppage database. They have actually kept track of union-led strikes, so it's certainly more comprehensive than what BLS has done. It is behind a paywall, but they've done that since the early 1990s. That can be a really good resource if you have access to it. I would say, they don't keep track comprehensively of strikes by non-union workers, and Catherine will talk a little bit more about that because I think that's one of the most important parts of our project, being to reveal this type of strike activity being undertaken by non-union workers over the last few years. And finally, it doesn't receive as much attention, but we also keep track of, since early 2021 at this point, thousands of labor protests. So these are non-strike actions, informational pickets, rallies, etc., that we'll talk more about later in this webinar, that may not receive quite as much press attention as maybe strikes. And our goal is to create a comprehensive database of strikes, but are still very important. And I'm not sure of other data sources that keep track of labor protests quite to the extent that we do. So that's an important component of our project as well. Our project relies overwhelmingly on an excellent team of research assistants and a lot of manual labor to enter strikes and protests into the database. A lot of those folks are here today, but we've had a dozen research assistants who have really made our project a reality over the last few years. I think I'll just conclude this higher level, if you will, perspective on the project by saying we really are trying to address 3 different types of audiences through the Labor Action Tracker, and I think we've done so hopefully somewhat successfully over the last few years and the years to come. First, and I shouldn't say foremost, but certainly the group that I think has most visibly, unsurprisingly, used our data is the press, journalists. So that's one group. And, I'm proud to say that our database has been documented, in hundreds of news articles and leading outlets like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and others. Because a lot of times when journalists, especially whether it's during Striketober in the fall of 2021 or hot labor summer, last summer really into the fall of 2023, are coming to our database for information, especially on strikes. So I think we've been a really good useful resource for journalists, and hopefully we can continue that. Number two, I would say, are practitioners. So, we've developed informal relationships with several different labor organizations and unions across the United States who are looking for more reliable data on strike. So I do think the tool is being used by practitioners. Obviously doesn't substitute for the actual work of bargaining, organizing, etc. But hopefully it gives paints a picture of the actual type of activity going on across the U.S. And finally, and hopefully, Daniel will be able to speak a little bit about this, but policymakers and researchers, I would say, is sort of the third group that our data are trying to speak to. Obviously, hopefully the Labor Action Tracker and hopefully my own research pretty soon, but in other scholarship as well, will be a good resource for academic research, but I think it's also already been used in policy-related research, to support different policy initiatives. We've presented our project in front of different governmental groups. I know the project has been used by Daniel and the folks at EPI and hopefully other think tanks as well. So I would say those are really the three different groups of stakeholders or people that we're trying to address the Labor Action Tracker through, and hopefully we'll continue to do that in the years to come. And like I said, happy to talk more about the tracker during the Q&A, but I think we'll dig into more of the details here. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deepa Iyer, who's our excellent project coordinator on the Labor Action Tracker.
Thank you for that background information, Johnny. I am Deepa Kailasamaya. I'm a second-year PhD student at Cornell's ILR School and a project coordinator with the Labor Action Tracker. I have been working with the tracker since the beginning of 2023. As Johnny said, our project has twofold objectives. One is to set it up, the comprehensive database that we have of strikes and protests in the United States. And the second is the politics behind it. We amplify workers' voice by creating this database. I'm going to run you through a little bit of the definition and the methodology of how we define strikes and protests, as well as the bunch of data that we gather for each labor event we record on our database. Definition-wise, we make a distinction between strikes and protests, and we believe this is one of the strengths of our project. We define a labor strike as a temporary stoppage of work by a group of workers with a set of grievances or demands that may be workplace related or not. In contrast, a protest does not involve work stoppage. It could be initiated by a group of workers or a group of people like community members, and the grievances can be workplace related or not. This distinction comes to aid when we dig through press reports of labor actions. That is because the press does not usually have a uniform definition of strike and protest, and this really helps us to come back to the definition and decide whether a labor event that we encounter in press reports is indeed a strike or protest. For example, fast food workers, they have organized over the last couple of years a number of national days of action, but it is hard to determine whether it's a strike or a protest. But in our database, we go back to the question, did it involve work stoppage? If it did, then we would count it as a strike. Similarly, a couple of summers back, NBA players stopped playing a session protesting the death of one of their players, and the press labeled it as a boycott. But since we considered it as work stoppage as per the contract that the players had, we labeled them as strike. So in this way, we distinguish between strike and protest, and it really helps us to remain consistent about what we call a particular labor action. Moving on, the next two important things to know about how we deal with sources is through our search and verification protocols. So the search protocol basically deals with the type of sources that we engage with. we make a distinction between them in terms of tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 through our verification protocol. So at the top of the list are sources that have spent a considerable amount of time tracking labor actions, such as the BLS work stoppage report, as well as the Bloomberg Laws work stoppage database. We're pretty sure with these sources that an event has indeed occurred, that they say has occurred, and it has been labeled accurately as a strike. Moving to the next tier, which is the main source that we rely on, tier 2, are media sources, usually press releases and news reports. And through these sources, we are fairly confident that an event has occurred, but we might have to debate a little bit about whether the event was labeled correctly. And for that, we use both our definitions as well as team meetings. Another strength of our project is really very frequent team meetings where all of us get together and we bring in questions and we debate over it in light of our protocols and definition, and take a call on how we label an event and whether we'll choose to log an event into our database or not. We also rely on tier 3 sources, which are typically non-traditional sources like social media. Predominantly, we use Facebook and X posts where labor actions have been posted, and sometimes Reddit threads as well. We also have contacts within the labor movement, and they give us a heads up that an action has occurred. But in case of tier 2 and tier 3, we do further verification by noting whether press coverage has occurred for that particular labor event, and only after verification, we log them with the necessary variables into our database. So that's a little bit about the sourcing. We have 3 different types of sources and verification protocols for each. In terms of searching for strikes and protests, we use Google News search and keywords. We do it a couple of times a week, and we manually enter the strikes and protests into the database. Those of you who are familiar with our tracker also know that it's not just strikes and protests that we track. We also collect a number of data that is related to each of the strike and protest. Okay, it's taking a little bit of time, so let me go back to the page and run you through the variables. We do collect a number of information regarding each labor event. For example, employer against whom the grievances or demands are raised. Labor organization, usually a range of labor organizations, anywhere from unions to worker centers to non-typical labor organizations. We use an acronym for the most well-known unions so that it is easy to use the filter function in our actual interactive map and search for labor organization by the name. Just to let me just show you the extent of data that we collect for each labor action. Like you can see over here, each of the data point comes across as a card like this, and you have more information about each, including the sources that are linked to it. So this is what I'm running through in terms of definitions about how we determine each of it from the sources. Local names, so after labor organization, wherever it's applicable and wherever it is quite clear, we make it. Those variables that are given with asterisks are mandatory variables. Those are the minimum variables that we collect for every labor action, be it strike or protest. The other ones are those that we collect wherever it is possible. Industry is an employer construct that we use, and we use the NAICS code to determine whether an employer or a group of employers are involved in one or several industries. We no longer use bargaining unit size. Instead, I'll run you through the other unit that we use, which is approximate number of participants. We also capture number of locations. Most of the labor actions that we have a single location, but occasionally we also have multi-location strikes and protests. In that case, if the location exceeds, let's say 5 to 10, we usually make a selection about which locations to log in. But we have a note section where we give the complete details about where the locations happen to be and how many we have captured through our entry. We also give the address, especially state and zip code, are the filters that you can use to select labor actions that might be of interest to you in terms of geographical location. We determine every labor action as either a strike or protest, going by our definition of whether a temporary work stoppage has happened. Approximate number of participants for strike is the number of workers who took part in the event. For protest, it is slightly more expansive since workers and community groups or other participants may be involved. Wherever this information is available, we try to capture that. There are a couple of variables that we capture for strikes and not protest. Start and end date is one of them. For every strike that we have logged in, we have a start date and an end date. The definition of end date can get a little tricky, but if there are questions raised at the end in Q&A, we can go into that a little more in detail. Duration amount is another thing that we capture only for strikes. And duration amount, we note it as number of days where strike was, work stoppage actually occurred. It can be as short as half a day strike to as long as 2 years, which I think is the longest strike that we recorded in our database. And one of the unique features of our database is that we count calendar days and not just work days, which means we consider weekends and federal holidays included in the duration amount of a strike. Duration unit is no longer, duration amount and duration unit is no longer captured. Duration amount is given in days. Authorization status is again a variable that we capture for strikes and not protests. Naturally, authorization refers to whether the local union has given visible support to the strike. That also, by extension, means that this refers to strikes where formal unions are in place. Catherine will speak a little bit about non-union strikes that we have captured in our data. Worker demands is perhaps the most interpretive variable that we have. We have 12 select list of demands that we have set, which have been defined, and we are able to reduce those demands based on the press releases. But there is also a tab where new demands can be accommodated by manually entering them. Once again, we use team meetings to decipher the demands if there is a confusion and to come to terms with new forms of demands that are coming up out of strikes and protests every time. Some of the important and most common demands that we deal with are minimum wage and COVID protocols, not so much more recently. Post-contract, definitely. Post-contract and union recognition are two variables which are pretty straightforward. We look for evidence in the press reports or social media articles, and we gather that as a demand if it applies. Healthcare and retirement benefits, again, are pretty straightforward as well. Healthcare refers to health insurance and benefits, and retirement benefits refer to pension and related issues. But the others can be quite tricky in sense that they can be capacious and they require a couple of things might come under the same category. For example, health and safety usually refers to issues regarding health and safety that can range anywhere from a demand for a special equipment to health and safety protocols at workplace. Similarly, job security can mean a range of things, anywhere from a sense of job loss because of subcontracting, outsourcing, or attrition of various kinds. Pay can also mean anything from wage loss, back pay, wage theft, and so on. And racial justice can also similarly mean any kind of racial discrimination at the time of hiring or performance of job, as well as a demand for a DEI officer and so on. So when we have these capacious demands, what we do is that we try to read very closely the sources that we have, and we also decide as a team how to code those demands in a more standard form so that they are easy in terms of the annual reports as well as the database research that can be done subsequently. Staffing is a fairly straightforward demand that refers to the number of workers at play. Usually healthcare most frequently has staffing as a demand. Other than the 12 listed demands, we also have a space for manually entering other common demands. The top of my mind, I remember scheduling being one very common demand that is not listed here, as well as union busting activities, which we term as end to anti-union retaliation. So we constantly keep discussing about new forms of demands that come about if they tend to be more common than the others. And you can find them, they'll pop in on this card if you select any labor action of your interest. In terms of source, we also link the actual websites from where we source. We make sure that all the variables that we have set out can be backed through our sources. Because web links can be notoriously transient, we also tend to save them as PDF files and store them, at least for the first two sources. Most labor actions have at least two sources. Some of them, because of additional information, may have more. Another very interesting thing about our database is the notes section. And that is of interest to researchers and people who want to analyze, because notes give the peculiar information about a labor action that is not obvious from the rest of the data that is captured. So for example, if it's a multi-location strike and we had to take a call on select locations being recorded, we always state how many locations the actual event happened. Similarly, if it is a solidarity strike, we do not classify them as a separate strike. We'll consider them as a regular strike, but we'll make a note of that in the notes section. So if you are checking out our database, please do make sure that you check out the notes section, because it might have really interesting information that is otherwise not captured in our database itself. I have a quick point on the interactive map itself. As you can see, there's a filter function for both strikes as well as protests. You can filter it and see on the left-hand tab side whatever you want of interest. Similarly, for each of the variables that I now mentioned, there is a filter function. So you can have, if you have a labor organization of interest, you can just search by its acronym and it will take you to the group of labor strikes as well as protests that involve that labor unions. Similarly, you have it for a range of variables as filter function, and that can be quite useful to narrow down your searches. The final point is also that you have a report a strike function that you can use to actually let us know if a strike or a protest happens that we have not logged into our database. You can also request to join our listserv, as well as ask for the database in spreadsheet format, because if you are going to use it for analysis, it would be much more helpful to have it in spreadsheet format. We also have an additional information sheet that we provide to you that has more definitions that is over and above the methodology section that we give on our website. So that is a very brief overview of the methodology of our sources and variables that we collect. I now pass it on to Catherine, who has been a lead author of the annual report this year and has been working as a researcher for the past 3 years, to give a preview about the kind of cases that we have that might be of interest to the audience. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks so much, Deepa. Hi, everyone. Just to reintroduce myself, my name is Catherine Ritchie. I am a recent graduate of the Cornell University ILR School. I've been working on the project since August 2021, and I transitioned into a research role at the end of my sophomore year of college. So like Deepa said, I'm going to be introducing a few cases to see how the map works and just of things that might be interest to you all. And I'm also going to briefly go over some of our recent findings from our annual reports, because the best thing about data is that we use it to analyze and see trends within the labor movement, especially right now. Let's share my screen real quick. Okay, awesome. So the first strike I'm going to introduce to cover all of our variables and also show you all is the UAW Big 3 strike, which I'm sure everyone is very familiar with. So in terms of getting to the strike, there is the possibility you could scroll through all of these, but that's obviously not ideal and it's not efficient. We know that, especially if you aren't very familiar with strikes or you're trying to figure out a certain thing, we can use our filtering and we'll go UAW for our labor org. And then we know it started back in 2023 in September. So we'll just have that as our start date range and we'll keep that to filter them out. So when we filter this, we get 5 labor actions in the United States because UAW had a bunch of strikes that month. Down here, we have our General Motors, Ford, Stellantis. So that is our big three strike. So if we can see here, we have our data for this particular strike. And since this is a multi-location strike, we have many different locations listed here across the United States. So I'll quickly run over our variables and how it works with the database. And since I think folks are familiar with this, I can also get into a bit of detail. So for employers, since the UAW was striking against the big three, we have General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis. For our labor organization, obviously it's the UAW. So we have United Auto Workers, and like Deepa said, and I want to reemphasize it, we highly recommend using the acronyms of the international or national union when using our database. Otherwise, it is difficult to find specific unions if you don't know their local name or their local number. We also have all the locals listed here from the UAW strike. The majority of them are from the second wave of strikes from the Parts Distribution Center wave, since I believe 38 locations went on strike there. Industry, we have manufacturing, pretty straightforward. Number of locations, we have 15. As I just said, there are at least just 38 locations with our the parts distribution centers. But well, as I will get to in the notes, we did not physically list every location. However, that will be taken care of when I get to the notes. So for this specific location, a cool thing about our map is that if we have a multi-location strike, we have all the locations on the map where we have used it, like put in those strikes. So this one particularly is the Wentzville plant in Missouri. We have the full location, 1500 State Highway A, Wentzville, Missouri, 63385 for the zip code. Strike versus protest, we know this is a strike. The approximate number of participants for this strike was 49,700, which we were able to determine using our news sources and seeing how many workers at each plant and at each parts distribution center went on strike. And we ended up adding those all together to get a total number of 49,700. The official start date for the strike was September 15th, 2023, and the official end date was October 30th, when the last employer and union ratified their contract. So that was 46 amounts in our duration, but obviously, as we know, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis did not, and with the UAW did not reach their ratification at the same time, which we consider in our notes section. This was an authorized strike, pretty straightforward. There was a strike off, the locals were all in support, the international was in support. For worker demands, as Deepa was talking about, we try to generalize demands as much as possible. So here we have pay, job security, retirement benefits, scheduling, and eliminate paid tiers. Pay, job security, retirement benefits are pretty straightforward. We use scheduling in this case to encompass the 32-hour work week demand for the strike, and then eliminate pay tiers, pretty straightforward, the two-tier system. While it is associated with pay, fewer strikes that we've seen specifically target the pay tiers, so we wanted to incorporate it in our demands to make sure that folks know this strike is about the tier system. We also have about 14 sources for this strike, which is a good amount. And in our notes section, we have the entire list of when certain units went on strike and which employer they were a part of. There's a lot here, and I want to get to another example. So if you have any questions, please drop that in the chat. The other strike I wanted to show everyone was a non-union strike, which is very important in our project. So I'm going to show you an example from 2021 in Utah when a group of movie theater workers negotiated and went on strike over pay with their employer. So at Redstone 8 Cinemas, about a group of 8 workers were negotiating with their employer, which was based in Los Angeles, for a higher minimum wage. They were getting about $10.50 per hour and wanted 15. When the employer, they were just talking this is a non-union workplace, when they were talking with their employer and the employer said they would only raise it maybe $1 or $2, the workers went on strike for about 2 weeks. This is a really cool example because what ended up happening is while the workers did not get to the $15 minimum wage, they did get to a $12.50 minimum wage. So even with a small group engaging in collective concerted activity, we saw that there was a tangible difference in their working conditions. which is also really cool. And there's so many examples like this for non-union workplaces. We have bus drivers in the South who will engage in stickouts that are not unionized. A lot of movie theater workers, Starbucks employees before union recognition will go out on strike. There's a lot of non-union activity that goes on in the United States, which our database is able to account for, which is really cool. So if you ever are playing around with the database, if you go to, if you can play around with that, you can find some non-union strikes. In addition to that, I just want to talk briefly about some recent findings we've had from our annual reports. On the same note as the non-union strikes, in 2021 and 2022, about a third of workers who went on strike were non-union workers. This number decreased in 2023 to about 22%, but a major contributor of that potentially could be Starbucks workers who were going on strike before they had a union election, since they didn't have union certification in the bargaining unit yet. The more workers at Starbucks that got their units, that would become a union strike at that point. So that's potentially one contributor, but overall, we're seeing that a significant portion of non-union workers make up the total work stoppages in this country. Between 2021 and 2023, the top 3 demands of workers stayed pretty consistent. It was pay is number 1, health and safety is number 2, and staffing was number 3. And one interesting find from 2023, as we know, besides the fact that the number of workers on strike jumped about 141% from 2022 to 2023, we also see that that in 2023, the number of first contract demands doubled. This also could be a Starbucks contributor, because a lot of workers who were going on strike at that time were now trying to get Starbucks to the table and asking for the first contract as part of their demands for the strike, because obviously Starbucks was refusing to bargain. There's a lot of really cool things with our project and a lot of good work that can be done with data analysis with our data. You can see like how the difference in strikes and rolling strikes specifically. We've been using our notes section more and more to talk about strikes that don't have fixed durations or don't have like a fixed number of workers in the bargaining unit going on strike. And we account for that in our notes section. So if you go and look at our notes section, which we've been utilizing more and more, we're seeing a lot more unions take advantage of the rolling strikes or non-traditional strike action strategy, which I think is really cool in terms of how our unions are adjusting to the labor relations field right now. There's also a lot more to look at in terms of authorization, number of workers. So there's a lot of good work that can be done with our data, and we have someone here who can talk more about that. I'm going to hand over the mic to Daniel.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. And thanks to the Labor Action Tracker team for having me today. Again, I'm Daniel Perez. I'm a state economic analyst at the Economic Policy Institute. And yeah, now that folks have a better understanding of the Labor Action Tracker, I'm going to share an example of how I've been able to use this resource in my work advocating for policy change. So to give some economic context background, research from the Economic Policy Institute has shown that unions and collective bargaining are important tools for creating good quality jobs, reducing racial and gender wealth gaps, and for ensuring working class prosperity more broadly. And we know that approval for unions is high. According to this Gallup poll, it's far above the past 30-year trend. And despite that, we know that union density has been declining for over half a century. And this is in part due to anti-union legislation, because employer opposition to unions and organizing is really fierce. And also because labor law can be really slow to make workers whole when their labor laws or when their labor rights are violated. So we know collective action, such as going on strike, is one of the most effective means for workers to counter the inherent power imbalance between themselves and their employers. We also know that strikes are full of risk and that not all workers have the ability to strike. And going on strike is full of risk. When workers do strike, their paychecks stop, employers can cut their benefits, including health coverage for entire families. In some cases, workers can be replaced altogether and lose their jobs. So the decision to walk off the job is typically a measure of last resort and only exercised when all other avenues have been exhausted. And this leads us to my final point, which is that when we began seeing legislation to expand unemployment insurance to benefits to workers on strike, this caught our attention at EPI. We know UI is intended to be a lifeline for workers and help them through periods of economic turmoil. It's also a really important macroeconomic stimulator. And experts, and I'm going to name a few because I really respect their work, but experts like Michelle Evermore at the Century Foundation, Amy Traub, Kim Deal, Gina Gary at NELP, just to name a few, have been leaders on this topic and have done really important work articulating how UI for striking workers is in line with the overall goals of the UI program. And I'd encourage folks to check out their scholarship. So yeah, extending UI to striking workers is consistent with the mandate of the program. And one thing I noticed when I was looking into this policy is that it was really difficult to answer some important questions like how many striking workers would be eligible to apply for UI benefits, and ultimately how much would extending UI to striking workers cost. As Johnny covered earlier, some of the major obstacles to answering these questions was just the lack of useful data on strike activity. Johnny mentioned in 1982, the Bureau of Labor Statistics changed the program on work stoppages and changed how they collect data. Only work stoppages that last a full shift and that involve 1,000 or more workers are reported. And we also know that from the BLS that 58% of private sector workers are employed at firms with 1,000 or less workers. So unfortunately, the lack of data on the part of the BLS obscures the full portrait of labor activity in the US. And this makes it really difficult to answer some of our key policy questions. But fortunately, at EPI, we're really big fans of the Labor Action Tracker, and we knew that good quality data on strikes was out there. And I just, went to this data source because I knew it had the granular information that we needed to know how many, for example, how many workers go on strike, for how long, in what locations, against which employers. And at EPI, we also frequently look at unemployment insurance statistics like utilization rates by state, how average benefits paid to workers. And so with these two components, I knew we could try to get at some of the unanswered questions and fill those research gaps. So I'm going to get a little into the weeds about how I analyzed the data from the Labor Action Tracker. And my hope is that I can give folks some inspiration for how to get the most out of this resource. So for one, we love the Labor Action Tracker map, as Catherine just showed us how to access it. But the first thing you're going to want to do is request the underlying data, the spreadsheet, because you're going to need that if you're going to do a statistical analysis. So once I did that, there are some transformations that need to happen before you start analyzing the data on a state-by-state basis. I'll zoom in here a bit. Some issues that arise if you're looking at a multi-location, multi-state strike, we can't just simply group by state and add up all of the strike participants in each state. And this is because some of the features in the labeling of the state where the strike takes place. For example, you see this labor action right here. It was a strike that took place within California across 3 locations. And so the state label is California, California, California. If we look at the next state, we have a multi-state, multi-location strike that takes place in 5 locations in California and 1 in Illinois. So we have 5 Californias, 1 Illinois. And so if you're going to try to group by state, you're not going to have a good time. And then there's also the issue of multi-state strikes and disaggregating the number of participants in those, which I'll address in a moment. There's some handy like code that I can share with folks if there's interest in how to consolidate to the set of unique states in each labor action. And so that's how I transform that data. And with this transformed data in hand, we're now able to answer one of the first questions we had, which is how many workers would be eligible for benefits if under their state's proposed legislation. Just to give context, there are many states that propose legislation, and many of them stipulate waiting periods before workers can access or become eligible for unemployment insurance. And there's a list of states and their various thresholds here. With the Labor Action Tracker, I can group workers now that I've transformed my data by state, filter for labor actions that had a duration that met the policy thresholds within each state. And then I can begin to sum up how many workers go on strike in a given year or month or week. So it's super useful in answering that first question. And then, so now that we have that data, and with that we also have unemployment insurance data that I mentioned earlier. And the second question we had was when workers strike, how long are they typically out of work? And then how many workers go on strike in a given month in a given state? So I can create a cost projection with all of this data. And this table right here, I pulled from a testimony I delivered to the Connecticut Committee on Labor and Public Employees. And this was for HB 5164, and it would have provided striking workers or extended eligibility to workers on strike for 14 days or greater. And with this analysis, we were able to show that on average, every month, about 73 workers would meet this threshold. We have UI data showing that the state average weekly UI benefit is around $436.50. And we also know that about 37% of workers actually who are eligible for benefits actually apply. So given that recipiency rate, we can estimate that in a given month, about $47,000 in benefits would be paid to workers. If we assume that union workers, which there's some research that shows that union workers are typically more engaged and more informed about their eligibility for unemployment insurance, we assume a higher uptake rate, then around $73,000 a month in benefits might be paid to striking workers. And then if we just imagine this scenario where 100% of eligible workers apply for benefits and that strikes for some reason lasts 4 weeks longer than the average, it would amount to about $250,000 in benefits each month. So when we compare this to the monthly benefits that Connecticut pays out due to a normal churn in the labor market, it's about $41 million. We were able to show that the cost of extending UI to striking workers in Connecticut would amount to about 0.1% to maybe 0.5% of typical benefits. So this is a really important, the data from the Labor Action Tracker made this possible. And this has been a really important tool for educating policymakers. And then I'll share one more example of forthcoming work. I'll try to zoom in a bit. So again, I mentioned that we can't disaggregate or see the number of workers involved in multi-state labor actions, and we can't disaggregate those by state. So what I'm doing now for multi-state strike, I'm combining this with census data. And we're using census data to look at approximately how many union workers are employed in each industry and in each state. And this will allow us to refine our cost projections. And it'll go a long way, again, in trying to educate policymakers about the cost of extending UI to striking workers. And I'll just note that all errors are my own and not of the Labor Action Tracker team. So I'll finish by saying that, again, we've been able to use this data to educate policymakers provide testimony and technical assistance to our allies in states that are considering similar legislation, and that none of this would have been possible without the Labor Action Tracker team and this resource. And if there's interest, there's some links to publications that have come out of this resource. And yeah, so I hope this provides some inspiration for folks for new ways of using the Labor Action Tracker. I know it's been invaluable for us at EPI, and there's just a lot of potential with this resource. So with that, I will hand it back to Johnny.
Are we handing it back to me or are we handing it to you, Anne? Sorry.
Sure, yeah, we can move now to the Q&A portion of the webinar. So there have been some great questions that I see. There are some responses to in the Q&A box. So be sure to check those out. I also have some additional ones here. But first, I just want to ask a general question. So to the Labor Action Tracker team, what is the most surprising or interesting thing that's jumped out at you recently in looking at the data?
I think Catherine alluded to this, but I would say our most surprising finding is that, non-union workers have organized a surprisingly high percentage of strikes. So just to parse this out a little bit, we documented from 2021 to 2022 that 1/3 of all strikes were organized by non-union workers. These strikes are much smaller in size, so it's only a few percentage of striking workers were non-union workers. But I don't think any of us expected when starting this project that there would be anywhere near as many strikes by non-union workers. And I should say what we haven't been able to do, but these are kind of two different types of activity. One, which sort of Catherine mentioned, are more spontaneous types of strikes independent of any sort of organizational affiliation, like the movie theater workers in Utah, or we've documented several strikes, walkouts, for example, during increasingly warmer summers, when air conditioning units break in combination in food service or retail type industries. So that's sort of one type. And then you have other types that are clearly affiliated with organizing campaigns, but aren't by unionized workers. So these are, strikes associated with fast food, no longer Fight for 15, but Fight for a Union across the country. Also pre-recognition Starbucks strikes that Catherine mentioned. So I would say that's the most surprising finding from my standpoint. But Deepa, Catherine, I don't know if you guys want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Also, another thing too, I don't know if it's necessarily as surprising as if it's just kind of driving the point home, is that, as I kind of mentioned before, the top demands are always, for the past 3 years at least, have been pay, health and safety, and staffing. I think it just goes to show how workers tend to have a lot of the same concerns. Also too, with staffing, we see that, especially over the past 3 years, there have been a high number of nursing strikes where their primary demand is safe staffing. So there's also, and I think this is where like data analysis is a really good, really important to do, even though we don't necessarily always go as in depth as other folks may, to see like how many of certain strikes account, in industry account for certain demands and things like that. And I think that's a really great and open place for more research to take place. And then also just like the increase in first contract demand within this past year was really interesting. I kind of said this before, but my guess at least is this shift from the Starbucks campaign into bargaining, from just election representation to bargaining. And something we haven't actually documented in writing yet, but something I've noticed is, especially particularly the Starbucks campaign, because I started a big part of my start with the research on this project was looking at the Starbucks and the Fight for 15, now Fight for a Union campaigns. How a lot of we've seen a drop in the strikes, and number of strikes from the Starbucks campaign, and how that lines up directly with how they have gotten Starbucks to the table recently, or at least made the deal that there'll be bargaining across all stores. So we can use the strikes in certain campaigns as a notion of oh, this is the union strategy to get an employer to come to the table, especially a corporate multinational employer. And obviously there's a lot more organizing like with REI and Trader Joe's. So I'm curious personally to see how strikes are used as leverage and how that changes the closer these workers get the employer to the table.
That's great. Thank you. We have a question here in the chat. How often do you review strikes that are reported on the submission form? Someone says that they submitted sources for the Harlow strike in Michigan, and it took a few weeks before it appeared on the map.
As the person who runs the submission form, that's on me. So I apologize. We will be checking that weekly going forward. And this is another important point. You know, there are other strike maps and across the world, some of which really rely on that crowdsourcing. We would love to get to a point where we can rely on crowdsourcing. So using our report a strike system that's available on our map. We've probably generated, I would guess, 5% or less of our strikes from that. We've generally relied on news sources, but the more we can get folks to report strikes, we can get ahead of the game. So thank you for reporting that strike. I'm sorry it took a few weeks. We'll be checking that weekly here on going forward.
Thanks, Joni. We have a question going back to, I think, what Catherine was discussing. Roughly what percentage of the non-union strikes are Starbucks pre-recognition strikes?
I definitely don't have a number off the top of my head, but I think at least with our 2022 data, I haven't parsed this out, but for the number of strikes in the accommodation and food services industry in 2022, about 90% of those were Starbucks Workers United strikes. I don't have the data in front of me to like see. I don't remember like what the distribution is, whether or not it was non-union or union, but I will say like they probably, because we were documenting strikes as, you know, these are small stores going on one day ULP strike. And for a while they were happening pretty consistently. I would say a decent amount are probably them, but that's not to, there were also, at least I think in 2021 and 2022, like bus driver stickouts in the South were also a huge contributor to that number. So unfortunately, I don't have any numbers on me, but I would say it's likely pretty significant.
Thanks, Catherine. Want to turn to Daniel and ask a question. You shared a really interesting real world application of how you've used this data in your work. Just curious, are there other issues that are policy areas that you've looked at with the data and that you could share a little bit more about?
So another question that's come in from some folks we work with is trying to measure labor activity after certain policy changes have gone into effect. And so that's something that we're interested in using the labor action tracker for. I would say the bulk of technical assistance requests are people who would like to replicate the type of work I just showed. And I would just say if folks have any interest in that, I'll drop my email in the chat and people are more than welcome to reach out to me if you need some help cleaning up the labor action tracker data. And also the folks on the team have been really helpful. So use them as a resource as well.
Thanks, Daniel. Deepa, you talked a little bit about some of the tough calls that you have to make when looking at the sources and trying to determine what to count. And you also mentioned end dates as sometimes being a little bit of a gray area. Could you kind of go into that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So demands is perhaps the most interpretive part of our work, because we have 12 stated demands, but demands can be really varied and capacious, and we tend to read very closely the journalistic sources that we dig into. Sometimes what happens is that the way the press reports it, like for example, contract negotiation, that isn't per se a demand, but we have to dig deeper to see whether that alludes to first contract or pay. So in that way, what happens is that these generic terms codes that the press uses, we tend to dig a little bit more deeper and go specific into the demand. So that's the first bit of it. The end date specifically for strikes can sometimes get tricky because let's say a strike ends and a tentative agreement is reached. So do we consider the date where the agreement is reached as the end of the strike, or the day when the workers report back to work as the end of the strike, and so on? So those are the kinds of, and by our definition, because we do determine strike as work stoppage, we usually determine the last day of the strike as the day before the workers actually report to work. So these kinds of things can get tricky. Sometimes it's not directly available on press coverage. Sometimes we have to skirt for more sources and definitely decide through discussions that how we'll interpret what we see in the news sources in front of us. So that's where the interpretive part of the work gets really engaging. And our team meetings are the place where all of this happens, and it's really exciting to be there.
Thanks, Deepa. It sounds like you have a really collaborative and interesting process for, you know, coming to conclusions as a team around these things. There was another question that came in through the registration survey, and I just want to say thanks to those who were able to put some questions in ahead of time. This was asking if there are opportunities for external researchers to use or collaborate on analyses of the data.
Yeah, I mean, so one advantage of our project that I think Deepa mentioned, Daniel definitely spoke at length about, is that we make our data publicly accessible in spreadsheet form. So if you would like a spreadsheet version of our data set, reach out to Deepa or myself, and we can absolutely provide that. And I think, you know, Daniel mentioned different ways that he's used the data set and some ideas going forward. So we welcome all those sorts of ideas. There's just, if I can mention one other comment I should have mentioned at the top, Ann, about the labor action tracker. I think one of the huge advantages of our project is that it's academic in nature, and what an advantage of that is, or why that's an advantage in my opinion, is we're really not constrained by political considerations. And sort of what I mean by that, you know, there are other projects, you know, and I'll just point this out. The AFL-CIO has a strike map of their own that I think is really important, and they have the advantage that they actually have contacts with folks who are leading picket lines, and you can sort of reach out to them and get connected with those on the ground. We don't have that ability to do that on our project. But you know, what's I think primarily featured on their strike map are authorized strikes by AFL-CIO affiliates. You know, we capture all strikes, regardless of if they're authorized or not, by all unions, regardless of affiliation. And I just think that's a big advantage of sort of being an academic project, is we can comprehensively document strike activity. So I just wanted to point that out, that I do think the nature of our project being academic has provided us with a lot of advantages over the last few years to be able to go out and document all strikes and not be worried about political considerations, at least not be worried as much about political considerations while doing so.
Thanks for adding that, Johnny. That's a really interesting point. I guess this is another one for the tracker team. Looking forward, are there changes to the tool that you've been contemplating? Do you see any changes coming up down the pike?
I've been discussing not to change the tool per se, but perhaps the way in which we collect data. For example, we are thinking whether we can automate at least part of it through a web scraper so that we can collect the news sources on point. I do believe, because of the interpretive nature and our strict protocols, that much of the actual deliberation over whether an event should be logged will still be manual and, you know, involve human beings. But maybe perhaps using a web scraper or a better type of server system, so that tech part of the things, I think we are thinking about upgrading that to a different method in the near future. But the work itself, which is the definition and the variables, we have found that to be the thing that we come back to when we face new concepts and new things that are going on. And so far it has stood the test of time, and it has been pretty rigorous and helped us through as new forms of data and information come in.
That's great. Thanks, Deepa. There's another one here. Could you clarify your protocol for recording other demands, e.g. fare scheduling, beyond the standards that you have as filters?
Especially with scheduling, I can talk about that a little more. We kind of go through all of our set variables and think about, does a specific demand fit in? So for example, like for teachers and especially workers that tend to do like bargaining for the collective good. So things like that we don't have already set in our data, in our variables. So we'll be like larger class sizes, certain community programs, implementing those. I think scheduling is an interesting one to talk about too. With scheduling, I think sometimes folks, it's very close to staffing because they affect each other. So with scheduling particularly, we label something as scheduling if it's a grievance over whether or not management is like changing the schedule of work or changing the flow of work. So staffing in comparison would be a worker's grievance on the floor. There aren't enough workers to help out. There's not enough people involved. And for that, we would put staffing. So like with nurses, like they obviously safe staffing is a huge issue with them, but that staffing issue tends to come from like just not having enough workers because of lower pay or low retention, high turnover, things like that, rather than how the employer has set up the schedule of work. So scheduling, on the other hand, since we don't have a demand that would fit into that, so if the employer is cutting hours, or if the employer is, we saw that with Starbucks, that went from like workers would go from 20 to 8 hours. If they're changing around the shift schedule, like without, especially with unions without bargaining, that would be a scheduling demand. So if it doesn't fit in the general vicinity of any of the variables we have, we'll talk about it as a team to figure out if we want to put it under a different variable. And for example, that's how scheduling came up, and especially with a lot of like union busting activity from firms, that's how anti-union retaliation came up. But whenever we try to keep those as general as possible as well. So if a new demand comes up, we'll try to use the same other demand that we're putting in based on our past practice so that folks can still find it in our database.
And I'll just echo some of Catherine's comments. So we view these demands as pretty broad buckets, which I think is also a point that Deepa made. Now, the question that I think Peter asked is a good one, because we don't have scheduling as one of those set demands. Something that we actually would like to do, and we should think of doing rather soon, is, we have a set of these 12 demands. A couple of them are a little bit outdated, right? COVID-19 protocol, $15 minimum wage. I don't know if it should be outdated. I don't know if that's completely outdated, unfortunately. But and I would say if we were to add some new standard demands that you could easily filter by or search by, scheduling would be towards the top of the list. What we started to do, and if you want to reach out separately, Peter, we could probably figure this out. Catherine, I'm not sure if you know, probably sometime in 2022 was to start taking a couple of these extra other demands and trying to group a lot of these demands under the rubric of scheduling. So if you looked late in 2021 and early 2022, you might have demands related to ending mandatory overtime. We would probably now group ending mandatory overtime under a broader rubric as scheduling, right, to create a more inclusive demand. But that is just to let you know, scheduling obviously means a lot of things, fair scheduling, end to mandatory overtime, 32-hour work week. All of that would fall under the scheduling demand. But what hopefully we'll be able to do, I can't say exactly when, but in the near future, is maybe we can turn scheduling into one of those standard demands, and be able to go back in time and group things that would otherwise fall under scheduling if we were coding it the way we code staffing, for example, and have a more complete list.
Great, thanks so much. I see we've got a question from Daniel himself. Does the Labor Action Tracker team have plans to add labor actions in years prior to 2020, 2021?
That'd be great, but that might be a little tricky. Just because, we're trying to, I don't want to say we're trying to stay afloat, but we're trying to keep up with the activity going on. So it's hard to say at this point we'll be able to go back in time. I always thought, and I don't know if Eric Blanc has done it out of Rutgers, but trying to coach strikes since the beginning of the pandemic. So we really start January 1 if we can get most of 2020. I think that would be ideal. But right now, unfortunately, Daniel, we don't have plans to go back in time. If we did, I think we'd be thinking about let's go back in time to the beginning of 2020, not any time before that.
Thanks. All right, well, there's been a lot of good questions. I want to thank the audience for that. I think we can round it out with maybe one just kind of broader discussion question. Going back to how we've been talking about the news coverage and this general, discussion of a resurgence in labor activism. Do you all see that bearing out in the data? Is that a fair description?
Can you repeat that, Ann? And I'll take a stab at it.
Oh, well, I was just saying, the discussion in the media and just kind of this characterizing recent strike activity as a resurgence in labor activism in the U.S. Do you think that's a fair description when you look at the data? Is that really bearing out? Are we seeing a kind of a new large wave or resurgence of activity?
Yeah, this is right. This is the primary question, if you will. And the way I've sort of handled answering this is it really depends on what you're comparing it to in a lot of ways, right? So if we were looking at strike activity today compared to the 20th century, you actually probably wouldn't claim that it's too much of a resurgence. For example, an average year in the 1970s, there were about 5,000 work stoppages involving 2 million workers a year, right? Last year, we documented just over 450 work stoppages involving about 540,000 workers a year. So in comparison to an average year in the 1970s, that seems quite a bit lower. However, I think it's important to contextualize those comparisons, right? 1970s, we were more of a manufacturing-based economy, heavier unionization rate. I wouldn't say less resistant employers, but well, I think you could actually say relatively less resistant employers. So the context has changed significantly. I think if you compare, and while we don't have, unfortunately, the data to be able to do so, the last couple of years with the rest of the 21st century, though, you could absolutely claim that it's been an uptick in labor activity and strikes compared to, the last 25 years. I mean, we're now 25 years into this new century, right? So I think in a lot of ways, it really depends what you compare it to. I do think another, changing nature of strikes is strikes are no longer looked at as a last resort. For a lot of workers, they are a last resort, but we've, primarily, if you think of strikes in the late 20th, early 21st centuries, they're primarily defensive to protect things that workers and unions have already won. I think what we saw, especially with the Big Three strike and other strikes of the last couple of years, the strike is being used as a tool to win gains, to make improvements, to make advancements. That's a really important qualitative shift in the nature of strikes in the last couple of years. Could even say stemming from some of the work CTU and bargaining for the common good, but I think it's accelerated the last couple of years than what you saw in many years in the late 20th, early 21st century. So I think, it depends what you're comparing it to. The last point I'll make is, our project does not really document. There was a question about the NLRB. We don't document, this question wasn't regarding what I'm about to say, but union organizing activism. A lot of people obviously are talking about that. But I think an interesting thing to note and maybe to use our data from our project, what's the relationship between striking and organizing, right? This could really begin to answer that question of, are we in a transformative moment or are we in a flash in the pan? Is this resurgence, so to speak, in labor activism going to lead to a more revitalized labor movement or not? The UAW is a great case in point. They leveraged a huge strike victory at the Big Three to finally organize a foreign-owned auto plant in the South in Chattanooga. However, they did lose a vote that I believe they're contesting a little bit south of that in Alabama at Mercedes. So these are kind of the questions that hopefully, our data can start to speak to, but ultimately it really depends on what workers and unions do on the ground.
Thanks for that really great answer, Johnny. I see that one more question came in, and since we do have a couple minutes, I want to make sure that we can try to get to that one as well. So a lot of the activity we see is not reported in the press. To add something to the database, how much confirmation do you need?
It is true that, like, for us to enter a labor action, we need confirmation that the event has occurred and that it can be labeled correctly as per our definition. So we mostly rely on journalistic sources, but we have a tier 3 source precisely for that, which is non-traditional sources like social media reporting and also direct information from the labor movement. However, a point on that is that even if we get information, we need at least 2 sources, independent sources from verifiable public-facing accounts that can be stored in a digital way for us to enter that. And if we don't, what we do is that we have a source of one source strikes and protests, and we add that to the list and we keep coming back to that. So for example, fast food workers, there are many small scale incidents that happen that are reported only on their social media accounts and not really covered on press. So in that case, we actually wait and try to collate social media posts of independent verifiable accounts that are public facing so that we can use them as independent sources verified as per our protocol. So these are some of the challenges that we face, but we get around it by discussing also whether we are convinced that the event has occurred and it has been recorded. Having said that, there are also press reported events that we might enter a couple of days after the event has happened. That is also for the same reason that we need independent verifiable second source before we can actually add confidently and claim that the event has occurred and it has been labeled appropriately. Catherine, Johnny, feel free to add to this.
I mean, I think you covered that pretty comprehensively, Deepa. Another thing I'll add too is we do tend to use like a good amount of social media sources for our strikes tracking purposes. So especially for like not smaller campaigns, but campaigns like Starbucks, REI, Trader Joe's, a lot of that is social media based. A lot of Facebook posts from district councils in construction and manufacturing we stumble upon here and there. Obviously, we can't get the full perspective of that via social media, but we do try our best.
Thank you all so much. Just want to offer up a moment for any last comments or remarks from the panel.
One more thing, the Labor Action Tracker, we're actually excited to be part of this international effort to create more reliable sort of alternative strike databases to overcome, these limitations are not just confined to the US with regards to official data sources. They take place in most countries exclude documenting certain types of strike activity to varying degrees. But we actually gathered with colleagues who have constructed alternative data sets in Brazil, Chile, Italy, Turkey, China, and us. I think those were the 6 countries to create an international strike report for 2022 that recently we launched on May 1st, not coincidentally. And we'll actually be having a webinar to discuss those findings with folks from all of those teams that I just placed in the chat. I think hopefully everybody can see that. If not, you can certainly reach out to me at jkallas, KALLAS at illinois.edu to get the link to be able to register for that webinar. But it will be June 20th, 9:30 a.m. Eastern. It'll take an hour and a half, and we'll have representatives from all 6 projects and talk about potential future plans to create more reliable alternative data sets and information. So just wanted to point that out as well. Thanks, Ann.
Great. Well, I want to thank the audience for joining today. Thank you, Johnny, Deepa, Catherine, for your work on the Labor Action Tracker and all of the tremendous effort that goes into powering it, as we've heard today. And Daniel, thank you so much for the work that you do and sharing with us kind of behind the scenes how you use the data in your work to advocate for policy change. So thanks everyone. With that, I think we'll say have a great day, and we'll hope to see you next time.